1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 16 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with what looks like a very wide open slate. If you're new here, I'm surprised because it's week 16. Most people who are still playing DFS in week 16 already have their content scheduled down. But if you're new here, welcome. This podcast is not a picks podcast. DFS is not a game of picking players. DFS is a strategy game. DFS is a game of understanding game theory, strategy, roster construction, leverage, and how to outmaneuver the field in order to get to a first place finish. So this is not a roster, or this is not a show where we go through and pick favorite players on the slate. I do have my player pool in the player grid on 1 week season. If you're not a 1 week season subscriber, just a heads up that we have a 90% off code on the site now. So that's you get the $229 subscription for $22.90, 4 weeks, 16, 17, 18, and all of the playoffs. A week pass costs $19. So $20.90 for, what is that? 7 more weeks of NFL DFS content, prep, all that. You can find my player grid on the site. That has my player pool for my tighter builds. But this podcast, where we talk about DFS being a weekly puzzle that we have an opportunity to put together. So as we always say on the Angles podcast, we kind of use this show as an opportunity to look at the picture on the puzzle box and get a sense of what the week provides, what might be our angles toward a first place finish. So because of that, because every week is different, the structure of this show is a little bit different every week. This week, we're going to take a look at what each position provides, how I'm seeing it, how you could be seeing it, because this is a week more than most where picking players is unlikely to be the reason you win a tournament. What I mean by that is we're less likely than most weeks to have these massive separator types of scores. We're less likely than most weeks to have, 2 players who score 30 plus when everybody scores in the low 20s, or like we've had the last couple of weeks, multiple players scoring 40 plus, and you kind of had to have exposure to at least a chunk of those players in order to compete for tournament wins. This week is less likely to be like that. And what's really interesting about this week is that there are a lot of options at quarterback. There are a lot of options at running back. There are a lot of options at wide receiver, and a lot of them are in very similar price ranges. So structurally, a lot of people are going to be doing the same things in terms of where they're spending their salary. And usually one of the edges we can find in DFS is just building our rosters with a totally different salary construction in the field, so that if all the players in a certain price range end up missing, well, then we're gaining the edge by just being in a different price range or building a different way. But this week, there's so many viable options. I tried to build some practice builds where it was like, what if I completely avoid the 5K and 6K wide receivers and just build through high price wide receivers and low price wide receivers? And I still, as I kept moving pieces around in that roster, found myself ending up with two wide receivers in the 5K, 6K price range. And so it's probable, because there's so many good wideouts in that price range, it's probable that at least a couple of them hit. And if at least a couple of them hit, then it's probable that some of the rosters you're competing against in tournaments have those 2 guys on the rosters together. So this week, we really have to think about where our edges might be and how we can maximize those edges. So there are a few things that I'm seeing on this slate, and we're going to go position by position just to give a sense of, again, this isn't necessarily the way to build, but this is the way that I'm seeing the slate, the way that I'm building, and how I'm looking at the picture on the puzzle box this week. So this can help you either orient your mind if you've been kind of scrambled up and like, what does this week look like? This will help you to get a clearer understanding of it and of one way to potentially attack this week. If you are seeing the slate through angles already and you kind of have a sense of what this slate provides and how you're attacking the slate, this might provide some backbone to your thoughts, something that corroborates what you're already thinking and allows you to feel more confident in it, or that gives you alternate angles to think about and maybe allows you to blend my thoughts with your own, which is really one of the best ways to play DFS. It's one of the reasons why I told this story earlier in the year, but I have this solo ship show with Squirrel Patrol. And obviously there's a component of, there's so much DFS work, NFL DFS work, that can't be done until Thursday, right? And so my Thursday and Friday are inevitably extremely packed. And we were kind of looking at my Friday schedule this year, and we were like, we could probably cut out this soloship show for OWS. Like from a business perspective, it probably doesn't bring in that much revenue, that many new subscribers, because it was over on Roto Grinders, and then in terms of like how I could use my time, like the value that we're providing to subscribers. And then as I went to communicate with Roto Grinders, be like, I don't think I'm doing this show this year. I had the realization, I do that show because I get so much value out of this weekly conversation with Squirrel Patrol. Usually he mentions one thing or two things that I just am not seeing, or that illuminate something in my mind. He'll say something that sparks another thought in my mind. And ideally I'm able to do the same thing for him. And we both get value out of doing the show. I used to have the same thing when I worked with Hefe and Levitan on the Friday Night Round Table show on Roto Grinders, where my favorite thing about that show was every week one of those two guys would say something that sparked a thought that I just hadn't come across in my mind yet. And so ideally, you're able to think through the slate on your own each week, but also use content from people who are doing good research and think through things well on their own, and have some ideas that are sparked on your end. It might be one or two things, but those one or two things might be the difference in having a big weekend versus having a disappointing weekend. So hopefully me going through this will help you in one of these areas this week. And let's get started with the running back position. So I mentioned already, it's a wide open slate. After I went through, so I write up my DFS interpretations, which if you're not on OWS, we break down every game in the NFL Edge. And that's free, by the way, all the game breakdowns. And then below the game breakdowns, we have the DFS interpretations. And so Pappy and Mike and Hilo, they write up the NFL Edge games. They do all the research, break down how this team's going to try to beat this team, how this team is going to try to beat this team, what the likeliest game flow is, and what to expect as a result of that. And then each of those guys goes through the game that they write up, and they put their DFS interpretations. Those are for subscribers only. And that's how they're seeing the game from a DFS perspective and who they might be pulling from that game. And then I do the same thing for all of the games. And so my Thursday is dedicated to finally, I'm building practice builds throughout the week. I'm listening to stuff throughout the week. I'm thinking about games throughout the week. And then I really dig down into my research on Thursday and go through game by game, put in my DFS interpretations, how I'm seeing each game potentially playing out. By the way, if you don't read those, if you're a subscriber and you don't read those, I would recommend every week going through those, because you're going to find, like last week, one of the notes in the Ravens game was like, is it going to surprise us though if, like, realistically we should not expect Lamar Jackson to have a big game here in a game that the Ravens should control against the Giants, but would it surprise us if the touchdowns actually end up flowing through the air, right? And thoughts like that, where it's not necessarily going to make my player pool for tighter builds, for single entry 3-max, those are the types of things that you can pull out and say, this is a really smart thing to think about for MME, these what if types of questions. And there are always those in my DFS interpretations and others' DFS interpretations, these what if questions of different ways we can think about these games and can potentially provide paths to large field tournament wins. But after I write up my DFS interpretations, I go through, and because I've already thought through the slate, I've built a bunch of practice rosters and kind of have a macro feel for the slate. But then as I go through game by game, I'm really focused on each individual game and trying to think of each game in isolation and what I want to pull from that game. And then when I finish writing up all the games, I go through, and if you've ever done work like that, you really get head down on one game. You're not really thinking about the other games. And then once you turn the page to the next game, you kind of forget about what was in that game. And so I go through full day of work, finish up, and then I go through my DFS interpretations and pull out, okay, what was I finding? Who do I like? What is my running back pool? What is my quarterback pool, my wide receiver pool, based on my DFS interpretations? So there are some weeks, especially as we get deeper into the season, where I go through that last part of the process and it's like, wait, I've got 4 running backs I like and 3 quarterbacks I like. Like, there's not a lot to like on this slate. Do I need to expand my pool for the player grid? Like, I can't just have this few guys in my player grid, because people are kind of looking at that for who are some of the sharp plays on the slate. Well, I can't just say only these 3 guys, only these 4 guys. And I kind of have to think about, okay, who else might I add into this pool? Who else do I like? Is this really clearly the top 3 or 4 plays, or can I think outside the box and some other plays that maybe are less likely to hit, but because it's such a small band of players likely to hit this week, maybe one of these less likely players actually ends up being the key that unlocks the slate. Maybe they put up the big score that you needed to have and nobody's on them because we're all focused on this tight pool of players. This week is very different. This week, I went through my DFS interpretations, pulled out the running backs who stood out to me, pulled out the quarterbacks, the wide receivers, and running back in particular, it was like 11 running backs. Well, running back is the most projectable position. It is the position where you can most easily predict volume, matchup, impact of that volume and matchup on that individual player scoring, you're less likely to at running back to get the blow everybody away, absolute had to have it score. We've seen recently Jordan Addison put up 40 plus points. We've seen Devontae Adams put up 40 plus points. We've seen, Zach Charbonnet did it, but mostly when we're seeing scores like that, it's going to be wide receivers who are putting up that type of score. The high-end scores for running backs tend to be a little bit lower. But at the same time, the low-end scores for running backs tend to be a little bit higher than at other positions, right? So you can really take that thinking and say running back is often in the position where you're not winning a tournament, and the main goal is don't lose the tournament for yourself here at this spot. We often liken it to the Patriots dynasty, where one of the main things that you'll hear retired Patriots player say frequently is you can't start winning games until you stop losing games. And that's something that Belichick would preach all the time. And even before you heard that coming out of the building, after these guys started retiring and doing media stuff, even before we reached that point, you could watch those Patriots games and very much understand that that's how they were playing. It was most of the teams we play, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to beat themselves. We don't have to try to beat them. We just have to not make mistakes ourselves. And if we do that, we will eventually take control of this game. It's why one of Brady's greatest talents throughout his career was taking a sack on a third down when nothing was there, throwing the ball away when nothing was there, something that you don't see a lot of young quarterbacks do. I was actually really impressed with Bo Nix last night, several times where he tucked the ball and took a sack, where a lot of young quarterbacks end up trying to make something happen there. Obviously, Broncos still ended up losing that game, but that is one of the underrated skills of a good quarterback, is saying, okay, this drive's done. This drive's dead. Don't force it. Don't make a mistake that compounds things. Let's give the ball back to them. This is a long game. It's battles, and we're going to win the war not by winning this individual battle, but by winning more battles than the opponent. So that style of play works very well in DFS as well, especially as you get into smaller and smaller field contests, whether that's 2,000 entries and fewer, 1,000 entries and fewer, 500, 300 entries and fewer. Kind of my favorite style of contests are these like 700, 500, 300 entry contests where you can really just play sharp plays and wait for your opponents to make mistakes. So the running back position is typically the spot where you really want to just make sure you're not making mistakes. So when I had all these running backs, it was like, okay, well, that's not how I want to attack this slate. If I've got all these running backs and nothing's really standing out higher than the others at first pass through, but then also all these quarterbacks and all these wide receivers, well, the position where I'd like to narrow things down first is the running back position. Now, if I had a large running back pool and then a very narrow quarterback pool and a very narrow pass catcher pool, I wouldn't mind as much having this broad running back pool, because you're going to have this core of quarterbacks and pass catchers, and you can mix and match the running backs around there. I would still try to narrow things down to, okay, but who's really my favorite running backs of the bunch? Who are really the best running back plays of the bunch? But when it was like a week like this, where it's like, I've got a lot that I like at every position, running back's going to be that spot where I'm going to say, you know what, this is the spot where I can really narrow things down based on what are the actual best plays. So the running back position, I won't go too deep into this because we have the player grid for the individual plays, but wanted to highlight these guys up at the top. So we've got Saquon Barkley, we've got Bijan Robinson, we have Chase Brown, and we have Jahmyr Gibbs. So first thing that's interesting to me here, Saquon Barkley, kind of fudging the facts here a little bit on this, because what I'll say is Saquon Barkley has 5 games this year that have outscored the best games from every other starting running back on this slate combined. There's not a single starting running back on this slate who has a best score better than any of these 5 scores from Saquon Barkley. Just outrageous stuff, right? Where I say that I'm kind of fudging the facts a little bit. Zach Charbonnet obviously had that 41-pointer or whatever it was. Zach Charbonnet technically not a starting running back this week, not in the role that yielded that result. And so in terms of what's available to us on this slate, there is no running back on this slate available to us who has put up a score better than 5 games of Saquon that are 36 plus DraftKings points. So Saquon is in this tier of his own. He's only 200 more than Bijan Robinson. He's only 600 more than Chase Brown. He's only 800 more than Jahmyr Gibbs. And it doesn't look like people are going to want to play him. And one of the things I like to ask in situations like this is, are we trying to just get consistent good scores, or are we trying to win tournaments? So we already said running back's not usually the place where you're going to win a tournament, but what if Chase Brown, who everybody loves because he's consistently putting up 20, 23, 25, 26 points, well, what if he puts up 23, 25, 26 points? What if Bijan Robinson, who people love because he's consistently putting up, I mean, let's look at his recent game logs. His recent game logs, we've got a 17-pointer, a 20-pointer, 28, 10, 32, 21, 23, 26, 25. What's he likeliest to put up? 21, 23, 26, 25, somewhere in that range, right? He's probably not putting up the 10-pointer. He's probably not putting up the 32-pointer. He's probably scoring in this low to mid 20-point range. Jahmyr Gibbs, this is a little bit different on Gibbs because obviously he's taking on this larger role. No David Montgomery. Realistically, we probably go, same thing that we saw last year. We'd probably see him play about 30% of the snaps. 70% of the snaps. We'd probably see him get about 20, 22, maybe 24 touches. Jahmyr Gibbs, with that volume, is a tremendous play. He's also, I wouldn't say a favorite to go for 35 plus points. What we probably get from him is 22 to 25. He's got a shot at 28 to 30. It won't be a shock if he scores 32, 33, 34. He's definitely my favorite of these other three guys. But then we've got Saquon up here with 5 games this year of 36 plus. He's got a game this year of, 47 DraftKings points and 49.2 DraftKings points. And people are, because you look through Saquon's game logs, and this is a very natural component of DFS psychology. You look through Saquon's game logs and you see 9.4 last week. You see 17.4, which is really close to the 20-pointer that we were reading for Bijan Robinson, but it looks different when you're flipping through game logs. You go back to week 10 and you see an 8.8 pointer. You go back to week 8 and you see a 15.1 pointer. You go back to week 6 and you see a 7-pointer. Week 4, you see a 13-pointer. Another 17-pointer back in week 2. And so because the dips are a little bit lower for Saquon, people are like, well, when he misses harder than these other guys. Listen, if you're getting a miss from one of these running backs, if you're getting 20 from Bijan Robinson at his price tag, you're probably not winning a tournament just the same as if you're getting 13 from Saquon at his price tag. And so this weird component of our psychology where we as humans seek out certainty, we seek out what feels comfortable, kind of leads to Saquon being lower owned than these other guys because his dips are a little bit lower. Well, his dips being a little bit lower, his valleys being a little bit lower than these other guys is also the reason why he's 8,300 instead of 9,300, which he could just as easily be as a guy who's put up 36 plus points 5 times already this year. So Saquon, I think, is a very interesting play this week. And then we've got these other guys up here at the top. And then really quickly, I'll just run through like some of the other guys, and you can look at the player grid to see. So again, I like all 4 of these guys. I rank them Saquon, Gibbs, and then Bijan Robinson and Chase Brown, probably in that order, but pretty close together. Other guys who I like, and I won't tell you like exactly where I narrowed things down on the player grid. You can look at the player grid for that, but I think Achane has a very sharp play. I think you can make a case for Kyren as a sharp play. He's kind of below some of these other guys, but certainly you can make a case. Same thing goes for James Cook, where he's got this sharing the backfield with these other guys. He rarely sees 50% of the snaps. You don't know what's going to happen with his touches. His floor is low, but he's got 3 games of 29 plus points. We think the Bills will score a lot of points here, and so James Cook could very easily put up a 30-pointer in this one. So James Cook, Kyren Williams, both kind of in this bucket where, yeah, they're a little bit below these other ones, but they also could very easily score at the top end of the running back range. James Conner is a sharp play. Chuba Hubbard is a sharp play. Aaron Jones is an interesting kind of sneaky play down at 6,400. And then you get down to Jerome Ford, I think is going to get some steam this week. And Patrick Taylor, who I think will have the backfield to himself for the 49ers. Obviously, there's some level of risk there, but Keyshawn Vaughn has been behind Patrick Taylor all year. Israel Abanikanda just came to the team a couple of weeks ago. So, and Shanahan usually likes to just run a backfield with one back. So I would think that Patrick Taylor gets those touches. And people don't typically like to double pay up at running back. So people are going to find some cheaper running backs that they're willing to play. So whether that's Kenneth Walker, whether that's Bijan Robinson, whether that's Breece Hall, Ramondre Stevenson, Jerome Ford, DeAndre Swift, potentially Patrick Taylor. But I think that all of these guys are viable. So the guys that I mentioned are kind of top of mind for me, but you could go farther down the list and hit on some other guys who could just as easily end up being viable or valuable this week. So again, a broad running back pool. To me, these top 4 are in a separate category than the other running backs. Patrick Taylor is in a separate category for me than the other cheap running backs. But again, you really got to look at this and be like, okay, I like a lot of running backs. What's the sharpest at the running back position? So again, kind of look at these top 4 guys as the sharpest at the running back position in order of Saquon, Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, and Chase Brown. But again, no arguments against any of these guys, or really no arguments against these other guys I mentioned, Achane and Kyren Williams, James Conner, James Cook, Chuba Hubbard, Aaron Jones. And then again, you can make cases for some other guys. So very viable to have a large pool, but also ideally you can kind of just keep looking at these players, thinking about these game environments, thinking about the usage on these players and narrowing things down. So on my builds this week, given the structure of the week, the next thing I'm personally going to do is, after deciding on the 2 running backs that I'm going to play on a roster, I am going to move over to tight end and make my decisions at that position of what I want to do at the tight end position. So the tight end position provides us with several guys at the top who are attractive. Similar to the running back position, these top 4 guys are in a category of their own. So again, at first glance at running back, I didn't quite see these top 4 guys being in a category of their own. But as I dug deeper, it was like, no, really, these top 4 are one tier. Then these other guys are really sharp plays. They're kind of a tier below. So tight end is a little bit more clear, right? Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle, Jonnu Smith. And similarly, we can rank these guys in a pretty clear manner. To me, it's Trey McBride first, Brock Bowers second, George Kittle third, Jonnu Smith fourth. But again, same as running back, no arguments against these guys. So Trey McBride, it just feels in the same way that on the week when Waddle first broke out, and I kept saying that week, like, there's nothing on paper that says Waddle's going to hit this week. I never play Waddle. He was 5,300 that week, and it was like, this just feels like the week where I kept asking the question, would it surprise us if Waddle has a big game here? It just felt like the week where that was the type of thing that could happen, right? And Waddle went out and put up whatever it was, 30-something points at 5,300 in salary. And then same thing last week with Davante Adams. We kept talking about, it just feels like the Jets, typical Aaron Rodgers MO is you take the lead, you start throwing short area passes, you limit aggressiveness, you just win the chess match, close out the game. Who cares about stats? You're probably not throwing for over 250 yards. You're probably not throwing for more than 1 or 2 touchdowns. But it was just like, this just feels like a spot where against the Jags, Jets season is over. Jets are going to move on from Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams in the offseason. It just felt like Aaron Rodgers was just going to be like, whatever, let's just pile up some stats. Let's just keep throwing the ball. Turned out that the Jags actually kept the game close. Aaron Rodgers still only threw the ball 30 times, but it was that thought process that led me to just keep bringing up Davante Adams last week. Well, he goes out and puts up whatever he put up, 44 DraftKings points, something like that, in that game against the Jags. So similarly, this whole week, it's been like, I just feel like this is the week where Trey McBride finally gets the touchdowns. I didn't even know until I was on the block party with Pete that that's something that has been a topic of discussion publicly for the Cardinals, something they were trying to do last week. But it certainly seems like the time is coming. Trey McBride has never caught a touchdown pass from Kyler Murray, ever. It's nuts, right? And so it just feels like the week where Trey McBride is likely to hit. Great matchup. The Panthers should be able to keep this game close and competitive. We kind of can get our thinking clouded by what happened last week against the Cowboys. But what happened the week before? The week before, the Panthers lost at the last second against the Eagles. The week before that, they lost in overtime to the Bucs. The week before that, they lost at the last second against the Chiefs. And the 2 weeks before that, they won. The Panthers have been playing well. They should be able to keep this game close and competitive. And volume for Trey McBride shouldn't be a concern in a good matchup. And it just feels like the week where he'll be able to add the touchdowns as well. So he's very attractive. Brock Bowers, we know what his floor is. It's low, but we know what his ceiling is as well. Next being George Kittle, where again, Kittle, we're one of these guys where, the targets really aren't there. The volume's not there as we would like it to be. He's probably not seeing more than 7 targets in a game, but he's got this big play upside. He's got this big red zone role. So the floor is low because of all this, but also he's capable of putting up, we've seen him do it quite a bit this year, 20 plus points. We haven't seen him put up like the 35 to 40 pointer, but we know he's capable of that as well. So Kittle very much in the mix. And then Jonnu Smith, a really bad matchup against the 49ers, but he's so central to this offense. Jalen Waddle's not going to be playing. And so Jonnu Smith's still very much in the mix as well. Those are my rankings for these 4, but you could rearrange those rankings and I wouldn't have strong arguments against it. I think Trey McBride belongs at the top in anybody's rankings, but any of these guys can be put in any order and it would make sense. Then there's like a clear distinction. And then you got kind of this mid-tier of tight ends that, Hawkinson's a sharp play, Laporta's a sharp play. They're priced close enough to these other guys that I'm probably not attracted to them this week, but it's totally fine to consider those guys, especially if you're building around a game environment. And then, and again, we'll save this for the player grid, like the specifics of it, but there's a lot of viable, cheap options. Obviously, Brenton Strange, we'll touch on him real quickly. Brenton Strange, who is going to be really popular this week. He's showing up in optimizers on like every build. He just put up this big game last week. He's only 3,500. People are going to be drawn to him. We should recognize that Brenton Strange had the same role earlier in the year, and he was consistently scoring 9 to 10, occasionally 12 DraftKings points. And then Evan Ingram came back. Brenton Strange took a back seat. Mac Jones took over at quarterback. Evan Ingram had 4 games with Mac Jones, and Evan Ingram was consistently putting up 8, 10, 11, 12 DraftKings points. And then Evan Ingram got hurt again, Brenton Strange again, and he puts up 18, right? And now everyone's like, Brenton Strange, got to jump on him. At the same time, like a lot of those were schemed targets last week. They were trying to get him the ball. He was very central to their passing attack last week. So, I think Brenton Strange is a perfectly fine play. I think it's worth highlighting that his likeliest output, obviously, is more like 9, 10, 11, 12 points, but he's capable of putting up 18 or more. So totally viable. And there's plenty of other cheap tight ends who are viable as well. We'll get to a couple of them in the bottom up build. So tight end, a very interesting position where there's really this clear top 4 if you're going to pay up, or for me, or you're going down and saving salary, and potentially saving salary in 2 places because there's not a lot of cheap wide receivers to love. And so if you're going to save salary to really clear out space for multiple players priced at 7K and above, 8K and above, maybe 3 players priced at 7K and above, well, you probably need double savings, whether that's a cheap wide receiver and a cheap tight end or 2 cheap tight ends. So tight end in the flex makes a lot of sense this week in order to, basically the cheap tight ends by and large are better than most of the cheap wide receivers. There's some 2,900 tight ends, 3,200 tight ends, 3,100 tight ends who are sharper plays than like a lot of the 3,600, 3,700 wide receivers. So there is Malik Washington, there is Jalen Coker. Those are both sharp plays, but kind of outside of that, it gets pretty thin where, Trey Tucker could put up a big game. Yeah, Tyler Lockett is 3,900, could put up a big game. Like there are guys down here who could put up a big game, but it's sharper value at the tight end position. So for me, it's like start at running back. And I wanted to really narrow down my pool at the running back position. And then each roster for me, I'm starting at running back. And I'm saying, okay, who are the first 2 running backs I'm putting in? Now, I could put a running back in the flex as well. Could put a tight end in the flex. Could save that flex spot for something else. But first decision is running back. That kind of dictates, okay, I guess if I double pay up at running back, I still can play Trey McBride. I don't have to go cheap tight end. But if I double pay up at running back, maybe that points me towards cheap tight ends. Maybe it points me toward Trey McBride. If I go Trey McBride, then that really dictates what I'm doing next, right? Because now I've spent double pay up at running back. I've spent 6,200 at tight end. My next decision point is the quarterback position. So if I've gone double pay up at running back and cheap tight end or cheap tight ends, or if I've gone high-priced running back, low-priced running back, and done whatever at tight ends, Trey McBride plus a cheap tight end or double cheap tight end, right? My options are wide open at the quarterback position after that. Again, double pay up running back, double pay down tight end, options still wide open at the quarterback position. Or if I'm like Trey McBride plus 2 high-priced running backs, I'm probably having to go to a cheaper quarterback after that. So my running back decisions are made independent of anything else and are the first decisions I'm making this week. My tight end decisions are being made largely independent of anything else and are the next decision I'm making this week. And that's tight end or tight ends, because I might have a tight end in the flex on a roster on a lot of my rosters. So then I make those decisions, and that starts to inform what my quarterback decisions look like. So quarterback position, to me, there's 2 clear top guys in terms of if we're trying to win a tournament. Not clear top guys in terms of range of outcomes, in terms of their floor, in terms of their consistency, but in terms of what creates a pathway to a tournament win for us this week. The 2 clear top guys are Jalen Hurts and Anthony Richardson. So we'll look at Hurts first. So we already talked about Saquon, right? All these big games, his consistency of big games, not consistency of scoring, right? When he misses, he's getting these lower scores than you would really like at his price tag. And again, like we say, keep in mind, if you get 20 points from Bijan Robinson, you're probably not winning a tournament. You might actually do well enough to make some money, but most of the money in DFS is in first place. That's what we should be targeting on our rosters. And so really, it doesn't make a huge difference getting 13 points from Saquon or 20 points from Bijan Robinson. In terms of like your ROI on a given week, yeah, that makes a difference. You can still finish in the money with that 20 points from Bijan Robinson. But over time, it's much better to chase the guy who can put up 36 plus points, even though you might take a 13-pointer, than it is to chase the guy who's probably putting up 25, 26 points. And when he misses, he's still probably getting you 17, 18, 19, 20, because what we're really targeting is first place finishes. So we talked about Saquon. What about Hurts? Well, what's really cool, and we explored this last week when we were on Hurts, and against Pittsburgh, he put up 29 points in that game, was that usually when Hurts is hitting, it's because he's getting touchdowns on the ground. If he's getting touchdowns on the ground, that probably means Saquon is not getting those touchdowns. And so these two have been largely either or this season, to where I think it's 10 out of 14 games, one of these two guys has put up 29 plus points. In 11 of 14 games, one of these two guys has put up 24 plus points. They've overlapped in one game where they both hit together in one game. But most of the time, it's like one of these guys is hitting and the other guy is not. And most of the time, one of these guys is hitting. Again, 10 out of 14 games, that's huge. Since the bye, when the Eagles kind of overhauled their offense, we have had 40% of games where Jalen Hurts has gone for 29 plus DraftKings points. And then we've had 40% of games where Saquon has gone for 29 plus DraftKings points. And so this thinking of, okay, if it's not Saquon, there's a pretty good chance it's Hurts. And nobody's really looking to play either of these guys. So if you're paying up at quarterback, obviously, you got Josh Allen, you got Joe Burrow, you got Jaden Daniels, but Josh Allen, he went, 9 games in a row without cracking 30 DraftKings points, because that's how the Bills are calling their offense now. You get into 2 games where Josh Allen has to take over the game. He's putting up these monster scores. Do we think this is that type of game against the Patriots, or do we think this is a game where the Bills are able to cruise to a win and they're able to play the way that they were playing for much of the season? So Josh Allen, pretty low, not to say you can't, but pretty low likelihood bet for 30 plus points, and now he's 8,700. Joe Burrow, same thing, right? The Bengals, Joe Burrow is a pocket passer. He doesn't need 280 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's not doing much for you at 7,500, and that's a great game, right? Burrow needs to be topping 300 yards, getting that 300-yard bonus, and ideally throwing for 4 or more touchdowns. Well, typically that comes in a back-and-forth game environment, and that's been the gift of the Bengals this year, is their defense is so bad that they're constantly in back-and-forth game environments. But the reason we were off of Joe Burrow last week, or at least I was off Joe Burrow last week, was they were playing Tennessee. How much is Tennessee really going to push them to have one of these types of games? So the same question can be asked with DTR under center for Cleveland. And then on top of that, Cleveland has really given Burrow and the Bengals a lot of trouble over the years. Not to say that will definitely continue this week, but certainly a chance that it continues this week in a game that the Bengals should be able to control, with DTR on the other side, probably less likely to be one of these massive shootouts than other spots that we've seen. And so Burrow, kind of an underdog for production. And then Jaden Daniels, all season, a lot of solid scores, very few truly elite scores. And then he's taking on this really tough Eagles defense. So totally fine play, but nothing really stands out there. So it's like, to me, Jalen Hurts stands out, and he's kind of the only high-priced guy who does. So if I'm going high-priced at quarterback, that's the direction I want to go. And on rosters where that initial decision, what am I doing at running back? On rosters where it does not include Saquon, the next thing, then move over to tight end. And then the next thing I'm asking is, okay, can I fit in Hurts on this roster? Do I want to play Hurts on this roster? Do I want to go a different direction on this roster? So not saying that 100% of the time when I don't have Saquon, I will have Hurts. But if I were doing MME, probably 60% of my rosters would have one or the other of these two guys. And so certainly want to have that decision tree of like, okay, running back, tight end, running back position doesn't have Saquon. Okay, now I consider Hurts. Now, if I have 2 high-priced running backs, no Saquon, McBride at tight end, maybe I'm not going to Hurts because I don't want to squeeze everything on the rest of my roster. But the rosters where I've got double pay down tight end, 2 high-priced running backs, no Saquon, putting Hurts onto a roster like that makes a lot of sense. Going down, there are a lot of viable quarterback options. So I'll read through them. I think all of these guys are sharp plays. All of these guys can have clear cases made for them as sharp ways to build this week. Sam Darnold, Brock Purdy, Matthew Stafford, Caleb Williams, Anthony Richardson, Mac Jones, Aiden O'Connell, Mason Rudolph, Drew Lock, and Michael Penix Jr. But who kind of stands out the most from this bunch? To me, it's Anthony Richardson, because again, it's this question of, are we trying to get a solid score, or are we trying to win tournaments? So what I like about Mac Jones, and what I like about Mason Rudolph, and what I like about even Drew Lock 16 plus points, both of his starts. Like, what I like about these guys is they're probably getting you kind of 16 to 20 points, maybe 21, 22. Aiden O'Connell has a game of 25 points, when he's had passing volume. He's capable of that type of game, but he's in the same bucket, right? He's probably getting you 17 to 20, maybe 21, 22 points. And that's pretty solid at 5K. And that might be what's required to win this week. If Sam Darnold goes for 22 and Anthony Richardson goes for 13 and Caleb Williams goes for 14 or 15 or 16, like one of his low-end games, all of a sudden, just getting this cheap quarterback who puts up 18, 20 points, that ends up being really valuable on this slate. But also, what if that's not the case? What if Anthony Richardson does put up 27 plus? What if he puts up 29 plus? What if he puts up 30 plus in this spot? Now, all of a sudden, you're paying $5K for kind of the safer pathway to 18 to 20 points, and now you're way behind those Anthony Richardson rosters. So when we think about what's going to make us the most money over time, yeah, Anthony Richardson has a broad range of outcomes. Yeah, you don't want his 13-pointer, but also he has potential in the context of the other cheap quarterbacks on this slate for all the other cheap quarterbacks to score 21 or fewer points. Most of the mid-priced quarterbacks, 6,500 quarterbacks, 6,200 quarterbacks, whatever it is, to also score in the low 20s or high teens. Maybe Jalen Hurts puts up 17 because Saquon's getting the touchdowns and none of the high-priced quarterbacks are putting up a big game. All of a sudden, Anthony Richardson's putting up 30, and he's the only quarterback on the slate putting up more than 23, 24 points, and that's just so much edge at the quarterback position. So this week could very viably shake out like that. It could also shake out in such a way that most of the cheap quarterbacks kind of perform at this 20 points and below level. Maybe there's one or two other guys who hit, but where these 25, 27, 30 plus points from Anthony Richardson end up being massively valuable. So Anthony Richardson, yes, the inconsistency is an issue. I've rostered him this year with, heavy bets on him on weeks where he put up 13 DraftKings points. And you're just like, well, there goes my weekend, right? But also, he's only played 11 games still, start to finish in his career. 3 out of 11 games, he's got 27 plus DraftKings points. And when you look through his game logs, and then think about a $5,400 wide receiver or $5,400 tight end, and you're like, yeah, this is about what you would expect from a player at that price tag at those positions. You got a 16-pointer, you got a 13-pointer, you got a 13-pointer, a 9-pointer, a 7-pointer, a 12-pointer. But what you don't typically get from guys at that position is the 23-pointer, the 29-pointer, the 27-pointer. He had the 30-pointer last year. He had the game last year of 17 points where he got hurt like early in the second quarter. And so very capable of putting up one of these big scores that at his price tag, you might, at his price tag and in the context of what else this slate provides, you might have to have that score in order to compete this week. So Anthony Richardson, kind of in that same tier as Jalen Hurts of like, yeah, the inconsistency is a question mark. That's an issue. But what makes you the most money over time? What has the potential to separate you? To me, it's these two guys. And then behind them, Caleb Williams, probably the next likeliest to go for 26 plus DraftKings points, obviously a low floor. Michael Penix, he's in this group of like Penix, Mason Rudolph, Aiden O'Connell, Mac Jones. We haven't seen Penix yet, but it's probably a pretty fair guess that he's the best quarterback of this bunch, right? Where you're talking Drew Lock and Mason Rudolph and Aiden O'Connell and Mac Jones, all of these guys are actual backups. They will be backups for the rest of their careers. Michael Penix, for all we know, could be an excellent quarterback. He's a quarterback who the Raiders were coveting, and they kind of had to scramble and draft Brock Bowers there after Atlanta took him. They're a quarterback that Atlanta obviously was excited to take in spite of having signed Kirk Cousins, probably has been playing well behind the scenes. And what's likeliest here is we get, 230, 250, 260 passing yards, 1 or 2 passing touchdowns, get kind of in this 16 to 18 to 19 point range. But he's a little bit cheaper than these other guys. He's probably less volatile than these other guys because he's a better NFL quarterback. And I feel comfortable saying that already going into his first start because look who we're comparing him to. And then on top of that, good offense, good weapons, good structure there, good matchup. And so, really like this spot for Penix as far as like, if I'm going to pay down and say, okay, maybe Richardson fails, Caleb Williams fails. If that's the case, do I think any quarterback down here scores more than 22, 23? No, not really. And are any of these any likelier than the others? No, not really. Maybe Penix has a slight edge on these others for putting up that type of score. But most importantly, okay, now we're probably just getting 16 to 20 points from one of these guys, 16 to 20, 21, 22. So who's the guy that's likeliest to get me that with the least likelihood to just crush my roster, right? Because if it ends up being a slate where Richardson fails, Caleb Williams fails, and 20 points from a cheap quarterback is kind of what you need to win a tournament, well, then in that case, getting 14 or 15 or 16 from a cheap quarterback, doesn't kill your roster, right? It's not like the Saquon, or it's not like the Bijan Robinson getting you 17, 18, 19, 20, or Saquon getting you 13 at their price tags. You're talking about context being no quarterbacks are taking off on this slate. And some of them are scoring 20, 21, 22, but you're a few points behind with your 15, 16 pointer. That's okay. And so Michael Penix, kind of that floor ceiling combo, I like him the most out of these lower priced guys. But again, there are cases to be made for a lot of these guys down here. So for me, it kind of goes the Jalen Hurts and Anthony Richardson tier, the Caleb Williams and Michael Penix tier, and then you can kind of go to some other guys from there. So again, my pathway for building is picking these first two running backs, deciding what I'm doing at tight end, and then moving over to quarterback, which if I'm taking Penix, am I pairing him with a pass catcher? I don't have to, because the bet on Penix is not him putting up a monster game that justifies playing Drake London at his price tag or Darnell Mooney at his price tag. It's not saying Penix is throwing for 350 and 3 or 4 touchdowns. It's saying Penix is throwing for 250 and 2, and this is a slate where 250 and 2 for a 4,500 quarterback actually gets it done. So you don't actually need a stacking partner with Penix. I do like the idea of playing him with Bijan Robinson, betting on this offense doing well as a whole. I like the idea of Malik Neighbors on that roster. If I'm playing Caleb Williams, I probably have 1 or 2 Bears pass catchers. If I have Anthony Richardson, I may or may not have Josh Downs or even Adonai Mitchell. If I'm playing Jalen Hurts, I may or may not have A.J. Brown. And so I've got the 2 running backs decided. I've got the 1 or 2 tight ends decided. I've got the quarterback decided now. And a lot of times that's deciding another spot among my wide receivers. And then at that point, it's kind of like, oh, well, I don't have all that much flexibility left. I have 2, well, on most rosters, 2 spots left, maybe 3, maybe as many as 4 if I'm just going 1 tight end. And if I'm not stacking my quarterback with somebody, then I've got a lot of flexibility on these last 4 spots. But on a lot of my builds, when I get to this point of decision-making with wide receivers, the decisions are kind of made for me in terms of what salary do I have left over, how much safety do I have on this roster, and therefore how much safety do I want to add, or how much do I want to take on some risk for big swings, what type of tournament am I putting this roster into. If I've got a bunch of if I've got some volatile players, I've got Anthony Richardson on this roster where his ceiling's high, his floor is low, and I'm putting it into a small field tournament, I might want to take the more like tight range wide receivers where they're probably not the guy that wins me a tournament like a Jacoby Myers, but they're also probably not the guy who loses me a tournament. On the flip side, if I'm taking Michael Penix and I'm betting on this being a spot where you really just need like the 18 points from quarterback, and but I want to then take some swing. Like I don't have a ton of ceiling at quarterback. I don't think this is where I'm winning this late. So maybe I take a swing on the Calvin Ridley. Maybe I take a swing on the Malik Neighbors, the guy who has a lower floor because of who they're relying on at quarterback, but also a higher ceiling as well. And so, or the Jordan Addison, the guy who nobody's going to be on, but we know he can put up 30 plus points. And so my wide receiver decisions are going to be kind of made for me based on what I've done so far on that roster, and then what's left on that, what type of contest I'm in, and then what's left for me to do on that roster, what's left for me to accomplish at the wide receiver position. What do I need there? Do I need more safety? Do I need more risk with more ceiling? And I can kind of decide things from there. So wide receiver is very wide open, and I've left it wide open in my player grid as well. And I'm just kind of going through all the guys I think are viable, because to me, wide receiver is not necessarily the spot where I am going to logically carve out an edge on the slate and dig deeper into the research and really be able to predict what's going to happen. To me, it's like there are a lot of guys who are perfectly sharp plays. And because of the structure of how I'm building my roster, the order in which I'm creating my rosters, that can kind of determine for me what my wide receiver position looks like. So for me, that's what the picture on the puzzle box looks like this week in terms of some of the players I'm drawn toward, and more importantly, in terms of how my rosters will be coming together and like where I'm narrowing things down. I narrowed things down at running back into clear tiers. I narrowed things down at quarterback for myself into clear tiers. My beta plays in the player grid, which is like large quarterbacks willing to play in large field play, it's a big list. My beta running backs, it's still a big list. It's like, hey, all these guys, they're not in like my top tier of running backs on the slate, but they're all viable. And I wouldn't even argue against if you wanted to move these guys onto your single entry 3 max roster. Same thing with some of these other quarterbacks, the Mason Rudolphs or whoever else kind of got cut off my list for my core pool. I wouldn't even totally argue against playing those guys on single entry 3 max. So, but I narrowed down my own list to like, okay, over time, play the slate 100 times. What makes me the most money? It's these running backs. It's these quarterbacks. And then when we get to the wide receiver position, because running back, tight end, quarterback, potentially pass catchers with the quarterback all decided for me already, or all decided already by the time I get to wide receiver, that really dictates how I wrap up my rosters, which has basically informed my decision-making to say, you don't have to narrow down your wide receiver pool these last pieces will fall into place based on what the rest of each individual roster already looks like. And so that's kind of the shape of the slate for me and how I am attacking it this week. Okay, with that, we're going to turn the page to the bottom-up build. If you're new here, what we do is we build a roster with a 44K salary cap. It allows us to look at some of the value available on the slate. It also allows us to think about how we can maximize our ceiling while spending only 44K. It's a great thought exercise. Kind of, you force yourself to build, especially on weeks where salary feels tight, and then you force yourself to build with a 44K salary cap roster and try to make sure you really like the roster. All of a sudden you realize, oh, I can have some flexibility on the slate. If I can build this roster with 44K, I've got 6K left over to kind of use this as a skeleton and build on top of this roster. We also have a bottom-up build contest that's free to enter. Obviously, still the salary cap on DraftKings is 50K, but the rules are build with a 44K salary cap. And there's prizes to first, second, and third place, free products and money on OWS. So again, great thought exercise and fun thing to do with the community each week, whether you are a subscriber or not. So you can find the link to the bottom-up build in my player grid or in the OWS Discord in the BUB Challenge channel. And with that, let's take a look at my bottom-up build. One thing to mention, we mention this frequently, but we've had weeks where the bottom-up build, the winner of the bottom-up build contest scored 200 plus DraftKings points. We've had weeks where the winner of the bottom-up build contest outscored the winners in large field main slate 50K salary cap contests. So again, what's cool about the bottom-up build is trying to figure out how can we maximize ceiling while spending 44K in salary cap. So my bottom-up build, where did I start this roster? At the running back position. And the first thing I asked was, is there a way to play Saquon Barkley and Jahmyr Gibbs on a roster with a 44K salary cap? Let's put them on there and let's find out. So first decision for me, running back position, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs. Second decision for me, tight end. Now, working with a 44K salary cap, we know we're going to be paying down at tight end. We know we're going to be paying down at a number of remaining positions. So this brings us to one of the plays I really like this week. This one's not behind the paywall in the player grid, and I talked about it on the show with Pete. So I'll go ahead and dive into it real quickly here. And that is what I'm calling 7.2K Puka. So when I talk about player blocks of two players from an offense paired together, I think the first time we ever did this was, before we knew how good Chris Godwin was going to be. And there were injuries on the Bucs, and Chris Godwin, this is back still in the Jameis days, and it was Chris Godwin and Adam Humphries were going to be the number 1 and number 2 wide receivers on the Bucs. And the whole discussion that week was, who do you play? Do you play Chris Godwin? Do you play Adam Humphries? And what I said was, just play them both together. And at the time, Levitan called it the double condom approach, where it was like, oh, you're being too safe, you're hedging your bets. But what we've learned over time with this approach is, because of the math of how difficult it is to get two separate spots correct, especially two separate spots on cheap players correct, it's extraordinarily plus EV to combine cheap players from an offense when their combined role is such that they're actually a really sharp play at that price tag. So these two players, and again, that was the very first time we really got onto this idea of like two cheap pass catchers from an offense. That I think that was before, maybe it was the same year that we got onto like the really cheap Josh Allen stacks in his rookie year. That might have been the first year of OWS, might have been the year before OWS launched, might have been the year after. But in any case, we also had like this really started coming around on this idea of just cheap block of points that covers multiple spots on your roster when you could get Josh Allen plus two of his pass catchers for 13K in salary his rookie year, and you say, look, nobody knows that Josh Allen exists. Nobody knows this guy is as good as he is. Nobody knows this offense is as creative as it is. Just take these guys. You're probably getting 45 to 55 points, and you have a shot at 70, which last week of the season, they ended up putting up over 70 on that cheap stack. And so always looking for these opportunities because they open up so much on our roster. So I'm calling this play 7.2K Puka. And that's because across Puka's last 5 games, so he's got the 44.8 pointer. This pairing of two players that cost 7.2K, across their last 5 games, they have a 13.3 pointer. So obviously the range is a little bit different on these guys. The floor is a little bit lower than what Puka has shown so far. The ceiling's not as high as what Puka has shown so far. But let's take out Puka's 44.8 pointer. Let's take out this pairing's 13.3 pointer. And let's look at the other 4 games in their last 5 for the stretch. Puka's next best game, 28.3. Best game from this pairing, 28.7. Puka's next best game, 23.7. Next best game from this pairing, 25.3. Puka's next best game, 17.8. Next best game from this pairing, 21.7. Puka's next best game, 17.3. Next best game from this pairing, 19.8. So all four of those, like games 1, 2, 3, and 4, have outscored Puka's games 2, 3, 4, and 5. So for 7.2K in salary, getting this type of production, I'll read through these numbers again. So there's a 13.3 pointer, right? But in ascending order, here are the other games in the last 5 for this 7.2K pairing. 19.8, 21.7, 25.3, 28.7. Imagine looking through game logs, seeing a player priced at 7.2K that has 19.8, 21.7, 25.3, 28.7, and then you realize, and I can cover 2 roster spots with this, which is actually more valuable than covering 1 roster spot with this, and it's 2 cheap players where most people end up struggling to get this type of production, and it's going to be extremely low owned individually and combinatorially. You just realize how powerful a play like this is. One of my favorite plays on this week. So 7.2K Puka is Austin Hooper plus Hunter Henry, because that's who this offense is flowing through. What's really cool about it is a lot of times with these 2-player pairings, one player is performing at a higher level than the other at the cost of the other, right? So one guy's seeing more work, the other guy's seeing less work. But if neither guy is high owned, so like if Hunter Henry was scoring 16 or 19 and Austin Hooper was scoring 6, but a lot of people were rostering Hunter Henry and not a lot of people were rostering Austin Hooper. There's no real edge gained in this, right? Because you're getting the Hunter Henry score that a lot of people are getting, but also getting a dud alongside it. So where these become valuable, and we really explored this a lot in 2018 with the Josh Allen stuff, but where these become valuable is where both guys are equally owned, or ideally both guys are kind of low owned. But also, and this is rare, what we have here is both guys are performing together. So Hooper's worst games are coinciding with Hunter Henry's worst games. Hooper's middling games are coinciding with Hunter Henry's middling games. Hooper's best games are coinciding with Hunter Henry's best games, because they are so central to this passing attack that when this passing attack is doing better and better, both these guys are doing better and better. They're basically the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 on this passing attack against a Bills team that should give up a lot of points, that plays a lot of zone defense, that will give up a lot of underneath passes. Eventually, the Patriots are going to have to be passing a lot in this one. And so a really good opportunity to pick up potentially 25 plus points from these 2 guys combined. And then obviously with the bottom-up build contest or bottom-up build roster, great way to round out. You've got Saquon and Jahmyr Gibbs at the start. Okay, let's throw in Austin Hooper and Hunter Henry, who cost $36.50 on average between the 2 of them, and really kind of opens up salary, allows you to be able to put those 2 guys on. So as with most of my rosters this week, first decision, these 2 running back spots. Next, tight end or tight end and flex. Next up, quarterback. So on this roster, I'm going Anthony Richardson, just to see if we can fit him in here, get this maximum ceiling in this spot. Again, no Bijan Robinson, so I don't necessarily want to go down to Michael Penix Jr. If I wanted to, I could go down to Drew Lock and throw in Malik Neighbors, or I could go down to Mason Rudolph and throw in Calvin Ridley, but I wanted to throw in Anthony Richardson, try to capture as much ceiling as possible on this roster. Throw in the Seahawks defense. This is often the point in my roster where I'm putting in defense, because again, it kind of gives you a sense of what salary is left, but also my quarterback decisions are not being influenced by which defense I'm on. Really quick note on defense. I've had a really great season at defense. That's been like my best position this year. And a lot of it's been, let's attack the Titans. Let's play the Vikings in this spot. Let's play the Broncos in this spot. Let's pay up for the bigger scores. And then the few times where it's like, there's really no big scores that I expect from up top. There have been a lot of weeks where, like the Cardinals a few weeks ago, where they got 10 points or whatever it was at 2,400, where it's like, here's a cheap defense I really like. So defense has just kind of fallen, fortunately for me this year, in terms of how it's been structured, how the weeks have shaken out, what's been available, what I've been able to see. This is a week where it's like, I don't see anything that separates a defense, which means if any defense has a big game, it's probably from something fluky happening, a pick six and multiple turnovers, something like that. So I do like the Colts going against the Titans. Mason Rudolph, not as mistake prone as Will Levis, but it's probably our best opportunity for just like a mistake meltdown in a game. Obviously, you got Drew Lock on the field. You got different bad quarterbacks, but on this roster, I'm going to throw in we got a lot of bad quarterbacks against bad defense, I guess what I'm getting at. But I'm going to throw in the Seahawks, a team that consistently can score 4, 5, 6, 7, occasionally can score 9 or 10. The Vikings, Darnold can take sacks, can throw picks. I don't really have strong conviction on any defense play, but I wanted to get in a 2,800 defense because it's one of the cheaper defenses I like this week. And we're tight on salary now that we started with Saquon Barkley and Jahmyr Gibbs. So recapping where we're at right now, we got Anthony Richardson at quarterback, Saquon, Jahmyr Gibbs at running back, Austin Hooper, Hunter Henry at tight end, Seahawks at defense. And we've got 3 spots left for 3 wide receivers. Malik Washington, really sharp play this week. A little bit underpriced, right? He shouldn't be 5,300, but he probably should be like 45, 46, 4,700. 6 targets last week. Some schemed usage, at least 2 schemed targets, at least 2 other plays where he was the first or second read on the play. A team that, they're going to be missing Waddle. Malik Washington, did I say Malik Willis before? Sorry, Malik Washington. Washington has a lot of speed. This offense knows how to use speed. And I would expect him to see 5 targets in the spot. And he has an outside shot at seeing 7, 8, 9 targets in the spot. So at 3,700, a very sharp way to save salary. Same thing with Jalen Coker. So we've got 4 straight games where a Panthers wide receiver has topped 20 DraftKings points. It was David Moore, then 2 games at Adam Thielen, then a game of Jalen Coker. David Moore has the concussion. Xavier Legette is out. So we're down to Coker and Thielen. It's not guaranteed that one of these guys puts up 20 plus DraftKings points, but certainly they've got a pretty good shot at it. So Jalen Coker, another really solid salary saver this week. And then that left me exactly 4,900 in salary if I'm going to have a 44K salary cap, which is exactly what Josh Downs is priced at. So I'm fine playing Richardson naked. I'm fine playing him with Downs. I'm not forcing Downs onto Richardson rosters, but I do like Downs on Richardson rosters. And so really ties this together nicely, gives us a final roster of Anthony Richardson. Let's go in order of how it was built. Saquon and Gibbs at running back, 7.2K Puka at tight end, Anthony Richardson at quarterback with the Seahawks defense, rounding out at wide receiver with some salary savers, sharp salary savers this week in Malik Washington, Jalen Coker, and Josh Downs. Exactly 44K in salary spent, 6K in salary left over. And I invite you to join the bottom-up build a 44K salary cap roster. A lot of fun, free to enter, and just a really good thought exercise as well. With that, we're going to call it a wrap on this week's Angles podcast. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Next week, we'll be here, same time, same place, normal schedule. Christmas is on Wednesday, so content Thursday, podcast Friday. Everything will be on track as normal. And with that, I will see you on the site throughout the weekend, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.